afternoon. My name is Aaron Mercer. I'm the Vice President for Government Relations at the National Religious Broadcasters. I appreciate you taking time this afternoon to come to our event on free speech versus free enterprise on the internet. Let me just tell you briefly about NRB. NRB is it's an association of Christian communicators whose member organizations represent millions of viewers, listeners, and readers worldwide. The mission of NRB is to advance biblical truth, to promote media excellence, and to defend free speech. In addition to promoting standards of excellence, integrity, and accountability, NRB provides networking, educational ministry, and fellowship opportunities for its members. I'm privileged to be able to start off this event by introducing the president and CEO of NRB, Dr. Frank Wright. Dr. Frank Wright, in addition to having a PhD in finance from Florida Atlantic University, is an elder in the Presbyterian Church of America. He has a long history of involvement with Christian ministry, including a 25-year association with the ministries of Dr. D. James Kennedy. Prior to assuming the presidency of NRB, Dr. Wright served as the founding executive director of the Center for Christian Statesmanship. Now in his 17th year, actually I think longer than that now, working on Capitol Hill. He has close working relationships with a number of senators, congressmen, and other officials here in DC as well as across the world amongst Christian leaders. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Frank Wright.
Well, thank you, Aaron. I just wanted to bring a very brief word of greeting and perhaps just set the stage, establish a framework, a more broad framework from my perspective. Our General Counsel, Craig Parshall, and his excellent team and our panelists, distinguished panelists, will frame it for you more succinctly. But I look at the state of speech and speech protections in our culture today as being somewhat in a transitional mode. I say that because if you look at the history of speech, it's almost always governments that abridge speech. It's rarely, not without precedent, but it's rarely that private enterprise becomes a major factor in constraining free speech. But that's exactly what is emerging here in America, really worldwide, I suppose, eventually, in these days as the result of an astonishing transformation of the communications landscape. Witness social media. Witness Apple, Google, MySpace, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, all of these devices. By the way, I love to talk to media consultants today, all of which are predicting to me what's going to happen in the next 10 years, none of whom had a clue about Facebook, Twitter, MySpace, any of it. None of them predicted any of it. And so, we take their future predictions still with a grain of salt. But we're in this place now where private enterprise, with these enormously successful, and we applaud their success, successful platforms of communication, is now becoming an engine of constraining speech. The heart and soul of the Milton Project was to identify the speech policies of the great internet gatekeepers. And as you may know, if you've looked at the previously published material, we looked at all of the social media platforms. We also looked at Apple's App Store, Google's policies, and we looked at all the major internet gatekeepers, the telecommunications and cable television companies who control about 75% of the access of the internet today. And all of them, from my lay perspective, have speech policies that look like they were written at the University of Wisconsin at Madison. They look like something out of the 1970s or 80s, enormously constraining the free speech of people that use that platform. As our legal experts will say and speak to this question, of course, the First Amendment does not touch on the rights of private enterprise. But we're now in a day where these private entities, we believe, are beginning to shoulder the burden of a new responsibility. The breadth and significance of the platforms that they control, the access points that they control to use almost all of the electronic media technology available to us today, is placing them in the positions of people that can, what is Google's motto? Do no evil? placing them in the positions of people that can do evil, at least evil in terms of the discourse in a free society. As you may know, Dr. Parshall, the Right Honorable Craig Parshall, our General Counsel, has spoken to the issue of why he chose the name, the John Milton Project for Religious Free Speech. Milton was a great essayist and some part-time political commentator. He got very exercised by the efforts of the British Crown government in the advent of the printing presses. As printing presses proliferated and became the means of communication, became the social media platform of their day, if you will, the British government decided, well, we need to license all of the printing presses. And the condition of obtaining a license is you do not criticize the British government under any circumstances. And Milton rose up and spoke against that in his famous essay, Areopagitica, about that and other things. And he argued, he never used this language. The language was first used by a Supreme Court justice, but he argued for the existence of a free marketplace of ideas. That's what NRB stands for in our, as Aaron spoke about, our mission of defending speech. We are defending free speech in the free marketplace of ideas, principally the electronic marketplace. And so we are at this point in our history where, while government still can be have an enormous adverse impact on free speech. Look at the Arab Spring. Look at what's going on around the world today. Free speech is in short supply around the world. But today we're seeing something new emerge, and this project, under the leadership of our General Counsel and his team, is moving forward, we think, to address it and to not just criticize decisions and choices that are made, but as you'll see today, to offer some proactive solutions, or at least the framework for arriving at solutions on how to deal with this. We're not here to boycott anybody. We're not here to propose, tit for tat, an eye for an eye. We're not here to do anything except to say that the free marketplace of ideas will always serve a free republic best. And if these private enterprises are beginning to lean in a direction and have the kind of influence that they'll have an adverse impact on the free marketplace of ideas, we think that needs to be spoken to, needs to be addressed, and you'll hear much more of it to that end. Aaron is going to come back up and introduce another guest who has a specific experience along these very lines to share with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wright. Yes, we're very grateful. Before I call up Craig Parshall and the rest of the distinguished panel that we have today, we're very grateful to have Steve Bradford, the Vice President of Operations for the Chuck Colson Center for Christian Worldview. Steve assisted the late Chuck Colson, as well as Dr. Robbie George and Dr. Timothy George, in the administration and operations of the Manhattan Declaration. The Manhattan Declaration was a project that was launched in 2009, and I'll let Steve tell you a little bit more about it, but it's had an interesting story in the subject that we're talking about today. So Steve, would you come up and tell us more about it? Thank you.
Well, good afternoon. Craig asked me just to come and talk a little bit about the experiences we had with the Manhattan Declaration. And just in case you're not familiar with it, it's a 4,700-word document that was drafted in the summer of 2009 by Chuck Colson, Dr. Robert George, and Dr. Timothy George, with input from about 100 other religious and Protestant, Catholic, and Orthodox Christian leaders. It was launched actually here at the National Press Club in November of 2009. It speaks in defense of the sanctity of life, traditional marriage, and religious liberty. And perhaps the last paragraph is the one that gets people most excited. Because we honor justice and the common good, we will not comply with any edict that purports to compel our institutions to participate in abortions, embryo-destructive research, assisted suicide, and euthanasia, or any other anti-life act, nor will we bend to any rule purporting to force us to bless immoral sexual relationships, treat them as marriages or the equivalent, or refrain from proclaiming the truth. as we know it about morality and immorality in marriage and the family. We will fully and ungrudgingly render to Caesar what is Caesar's, but under no circumstances will we render to Caesar what is God's. So that was launched in November of 2009, and by January of 2010, about 3 months later, the online signature count of people, Christians in support of this, had reached 370,000. So during that summer of 2010, we began working on an app specifically for iPhones, and it could be used on the iPads then. That went through Apple's review process with no problems, and on October 14th, we launched the Apple iPhone app, and it was rated at 4+ by Apple for no objectionable content. And then during the Thanksgiving holiday in November of 2010, about a year later, over the weekend, I got a phone call from a guy that works with me, and he said, "Hey, the Manhattan Declaration app's gone." And I said, "You know what, that can't be right." And so we started looking, and we learned that Apple Corporation had just quietly removed the app from its iTunes store in response to about 7,700 pro-gay petitioners who did a petition through change.org. So on Monday morning, November 29th, we started to get into action. We faxed a letter to Steve Jobs. We went through their PR department, and we went through the official channels that our app developer had used to try and find out why it had been removed. And it was interesting, we never heard one response from Apple. We did see in an interview on Tuesday or Wednesday that a media representative for Apple told reporters, but not the Manhattan Declaration, that the app was removed because it violated their policy against apps that offend large groups of people. And so we started to use back channels as well. We had some contacts through Biola University, actually, with some of the senior people at Apple, and they said, "Steve Jobs is aware of this. Just sit tight, don't do anything. If you start pushing too hard, he'll just dig in his heels." So we waited until the end of the week, and then we went public with it, and we issued a press release, and we sent out emails to, by then, approximately 400,000 people who were on our email list. We asked them to do 4 things: contact or email Steve Jobs, and we left the email address, it's public, or their PR department. We put up a petition to ask Apple to reinstate the app, and as of this date, there are 63,000 people that have signed that. We asked them to recruit their friends to contact Apple or to sign the Manhattan Declaration to show their support, and then to get social, to use Facebook, Twitter, and the rest of the social media outlets that they could do. And again, we never heard anything from Apple. And it seems that the questionnaire, as we saw different interviews then later, there was a part of the app said, "Answer these questions." And one of those was, "Do you believe that marriage is only between a man and a woman?" If you answered no, it would just say, "You know, that's incorrect. Here's some references so you can do that." So that was the one that offended them. So we went back, we redid the app with our developer. We took out that set of questions, so the app was then just an opportunity to read the Manhattan Declaration and to sign it to show your support. We refiled it, or resubmitted it with Apple on December 8th, and on December 22nd, they just rejected it. And the reason was given that it's offensive. Apps containing references or commentary about a religious, cultural, or ethnic group that are defamatory, offensive, mean-spirited, or likely to expose the targeted group to harm or violence will be rejected. We have evaluated the content of your application and consider its contents to be objectionable and potentially harmful to others. And so, and again, this was the only communication we had from Apple. On January 6th, we sent registered letters to all of the Apple board members and again to Steve Jobs, and asked them to, in the spirit of free discourse, to reinstate the app and to have a dialogue with us. And we never heard anything from any of the board members or again Steve Jobs. We also explored other things. We tried to find out if we could attend the shareholders meeting, but by then the date to purchase stock had passed. We were actually contacted by the ACLU in California in January, and they suggested that perhaps we had a case against Apple and they would like to review it. And after about a month, they came back and they said there's some law in California, you guys probably know this better, and they said it really prohibits you from winning any kind of case against Apple. And then we talked to our friends at the Alliance Defending Freedom, and they were very supportive. But again, they said, you know, that this probably isn't a case we're going to win. And so one of Chuck's biggest frustrations in the last years of his life, last months of his life, was that we couldn't ever do anything with Apple. And we would get comments from people who had signed saying, you know, what did you guys do? You rolled over and you caved on this. But we had no idea, after contacting the president, going to the board of directors, asking people to sign petitions, and you get absolutely no response from them what to do next. And so at this date, we still have no app. The Manhattan Declaration is enabled so you can view it on the different mobile devices, but it's not officially in the App Store. So that concludes that sad chapter. But thank you, Aaron, for the opportunity.
Steve, thank you very much for sharing that story. It's now my privilege to introduce Craig Parshall, who is the Senior Vice President and General Counsel for NRB. Craig gets to handle all the legal, regulatory, and constitutional issues that implicate NRB's mission to maximize freedoms for Christian broadcasters and communicators. Craig is also the director of the John Milton Project for Religious Free Speech, which is holding this event today. Prior to coming to NRB, Craig was a civil liberties attorney, and he has represented clients throughout the U.S. court system, all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court, as well as a number of state Supreme Courts. Craig, on behalf of NRB, has testified numerous times in the House and the Senate on religious freedom issues. He's also represented NRB several times publicly before the FCC. Craig is also a best-selling novelist, he has, I believe, 9 suspense novels, maybe more at this point, and he's married to nationally syndicated Christian radio broadcaster Janet Parshall. So thank you, Craig, and I'll hand it over to Craig, and he'll talk more about the actual charter that we're unveiling today.
Thank you, Aaron. First of all, I know Apple has received a drubbing today of sorts, but I carry their iPad wherever I go. Their innovations, as Dr. Wright said, are spectacular, and we owe them a debt of gratitude for the way in which they've created great functionality, interconnectivity, spontaneity in our communications. That having been said, we're here to talk about resolving problems, not creating them. As Dr. Wright, I thought, did a magnificent job of laying this out. We want a dialogue, but as Steve Bradford indicated, the dialogue at this point seems to be in one direction, from us to them, and we wait. By the way, I'm very excited about the group of panelists that we have today, and we're very, very privileged to have people from not only media technology, but experts in journalism, law, and religious liberty issues and policy to try to winnow out the chaff from the wheat and figure out where we go from here. Now, today is an interesting day because I see it as a day that creates 2 events, one intriguing, the other tragic, but they both speak a little bit to this conflict about freedom of speech. Apple, at least according to press reports, was going to release and announce its iPhone 5 today. And economists have said that this iPhone 5 may well add up to a half a point toward a GDP, and in consideration of the fact that we've been talking about minimal growth at about 2%, that's huge. So their contribution not only to innovation but to economy is significant. However, you've heard the other side of Apple, and that is they're exercising their freedom to choose content, and sometimes based on the viewpoint expressed, they have chosen to prohibit certain kinds of content, and that's what we're going to talk about today. The other instance, very tragic one, was the news that happened last night. The U.S. ambassador has been killed along with several staff members over in Libya, purportedly because protesters there were responding to an anti-Islamic video that was produced in America. Now, there will be voices as there have been when there have been other tragedies like this. I'm sure there are going to be voices calling for restriction of certain kinds of speech because it bears too much of a potential to generate violence. But NRB takes the position that any lawful speech, and we're going to be talking during a panel about lawful versus unlawful, but lawful speech that may be judged by some groups to be inflammatory or at least disagreeable should not be the subject of the restriction. The restriction should be aimed at those that would work violence because others have exercised their religious free speech rights. So today is an important day. But if we look back historically, I'm a sort of an amateur student of history, and I read Alexis de Tocqueville's treatise on what was happening in America in the early 1800s and why America was the phenomenal success against all odds. Two of the things that he noticed were, number one, what he called our religious zeal. And we might repackage that and say it's our religious heritage of expression, our religious ability to express deeply held beliefs about God and man and the relationship between the two of them. The other thing he noticed was the great growth of business and manufacturing and industry in America, free enterprise. And he says, as a matter of fact, against insurmountable odds, America was one of the #1 maritime industries in the world just a few decades after our birth as a nation, and he listed a handful of other industries that were growing by leaps and bounds almost daily. So innovation and free enterprise, religious expression. Two of the pillars of what has made America great, and yet they seem to be at odds right now. Now, you've heard some reference to our white paper, True Liberty in a New Media Age, and we've got copies here to pass out to you. But in summary, we analyze the policies and the practices. And the policies are in writing, so they're very easy to access, and the practices a little bit more difficult to access of these new media companies. But we started seeing some danger signs from Google, Apple, Facebook in particular. Twitter was the only one at the time that passed muster from our standpoint in terms of a healthy, robust recognition of free speech. Now, recently, I've heard and read a few statements from Twitter that would suggest that they're now struggling with how robust a free speech approach they're going to have on Twitter. But so far, we certainly respected the fact that there are no overt anti-religious acts of censorship that they've committed. We also looked at the big telecom companies, but we're focusing right now really on what we describe as the new media. That was September of 2011 when we unveiled that white paper report. We did it in this building. After we did that, unfortunately, we have continued to see examples of censorship, which we believe we all ought to feel uncomfortable about and find them to be somewhat disturbing. As an example, Google-owned YouTube has taken down comments from a rabbi that were giving the Old Testament view of the biblical basis for a man and a woman marriage and his opposition to some statements made by the administration that seemed too tolerant, in his opinion, of same-sex marriage. Also, YouTube has taken down an expose, a series of documentaries and videos by Lila Rose, where she went into Planned Parenthood abortion clinics and she was trying to expose, from her perspective, what she thought were abuses taking place in Planned Parenthood clinics. Those were taken down. Furthermore, there was a message delivered by a youth pastor, also taken down because he was supporting a biblical Christian worldview of marriage and opposing same-sex marriage. And then we switch over to Facebook, and of course, most of us are familiar now with the Chick-fil-A controversy and the fact that Governor Mike Huckabee had his Facebook page taken down for 12 hours immediately after he supported Chick-fil-A and called on people to frequent it on a pro-Chick-fil-A day because of their position, the CEO's position, in support of traditional marriage. So I think these are all very troubling signs that the problems we saw a year ago are continuing, that we haven't seen them abate. We haven't seen any solutions being offered. That's one of the reasons that NRB is offering these solutions ourselves. Now, I mentioned Apple's innovational excellence and their contribution to the economy, and this is the free market part of this equation, and at NRB we believe in the free market principle. we think that there's a biblical basis that Christians believe in the free market position and principle. We also believe our Constitution presumes that. If you take a look at what the Wall Street Journal said some time ago about Apple's sales a year ago, and I was talking about their Apple iPhone number 5, but a year ago, economists were talking about the fact that about 4% of the S&P 500 stock index increase may have been caused by Apple's sales. In other words, they may have boosted the S&P 500 simply by their products alone, just this one company. So we don't want to overlook the contribution that these companies make from a financial standpoint. We also don't want to overlook the free speech values that we believe citizens, both citizen journalists and professional journalists, and just plain ordinary American citizens, the values that they hold dear and the free speech rights that they should be given. Now, what does our charter say? What is it all about? The charter is a very short document. It basically asks this question. If people like Mark Zuckerberg, the founder and innovator behind Facebook, who made a statement about a year ago on 60 Minutes, where he said, when you give everyone a voice and give people power, the system usually ends up in a very good place. So what we view as our role is giving people that power. And he was talking about social media. And he's really impliedly saying giving a voice would be consistent with an attitude of free speech. But other new media leaders and principals, like Carl Schmidt at Google and others, have articulated the same kind of idea. Openness, freedom of information on the internet is a phenomenon. As a matter of fact, many of them have pointed to the new media as a driving force behind the so-called Arab Spring. Now, yet to be determined what the direction of that Arab Spring is going to take. But we do know this, that it was instrumental in working a phenomenal change in a number of regimes in a very short period of time. So how does our charter approach this? There have been a number of internet freedom charters, and we're going to be talking about a couple of those. But this one's different because they're directed at the companies. And they're directed at the companies in a way where we're only asking them to do one thing, and that is to voluntarily assume the responsibility to create a more robust free speech practice and policy for American users and users from around the world. How would we do this? Simply this. Here's the question. Why would these companies who have made these pronouncements about free speech, freedom of information, and empowering the voice of the people, why would they offer the American people less than what the First Amendment would protect? But that's what's happening. The First Amendment technically does not apply to the actions of private companies. There may be some exceptions that we can talk about in our panel discussion. But why would a lower, lesser form of free speech than is afforded by the First Amendment of the United States Constitution be the standard that these companies would gravitate to? Our charter simply asks this. Why don't you assume on yourself the mantle of responsibility to treat yourself as if the First Amendment did apply? What would that look like? Would that impinge your ability to innovate? Would that interfere with your business activities and your corporate decision making? We think the answer would be no. Would it enrich these platforms for posterity in terms of facilitating free speech? Undoubtedly it would. And we, as you'll see in our charter, talked about some of the little nuances, and lawyers are